I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santa Maria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. We try to deal with issues on this podcast chronotopically. It's a term, I don't know if I coined it or not. I would love to take credit for it, but it's basically a serialized history, and we progress chronologically, but episode to episode tends to focus on singular topics. It's a balance to kind of keep things simple and comprehensible, but also means that a little context is lost as we shift from topic to topic within the chronological timeline. An issue which constantly plagued Nauvoo Mormonism was polygamy. We can't ignore or forget how much drama and tension was created by practicing polygamy among the highest-ranking Mormon elites while they were trying to keep outsiders from knowing too much. Rumors of polygamy would inevitably result while the practice was spreading. For the leadership on the inside, those rumors could be useful if they were kept in check. You see, it's much easier to approach a prospective polygynous wife with a proposal if she's already heard that celestial marriage is going on. This was her ticket to the new and everlasting covenant of marriage, the highest circle of Mormon ascendancy, both in this life and the afterlife. Once you're on the inside of this select circle, you're guaranteed exaltation and your own planet with your new husband. In these cases, allowing rumors of polygamy to propagate helped the practice grow, and it prepped people to accept this new model of families. However, the negative consequences couldn't be separated from the positive. This Victorian era of American history balked at the idea of adultery or any kind of relationship outside the standard one-man, one-woman model of a nuclear family. Contradicting those societal norms came with differing levels of conflict and accusations of polygamy, and those were a constant thread in the church. But it wasn't just the Nauvoo church. As we've discussed on the show before, Joe was accused of adultery as far back as 1829, before the church was even started, and other church leaders, including Martin Harris, were accused of the same within the first 2 years of the church running. The first official circular published by the church became part of the canonized revelations, which included a decree that, quote, one man should have but one wife and one woman but one husband, end quote. During the year of 1838, when the church was headquartered at Missouri, Joe published a pamphlet titled Answers to Sundry Questions in the Elder's Journal. The seventh question that he answered was to hopefully try and answer to these accusations. Now, it is notable that Joe had already been removed from the Kirtland Church for the Fanny Alger incident, among other things, and he had likely taken Lucinda Morgan Harris to wife when this was published. The seventh question reads as follows, quote, Seventh, do the Mormons believe in having more wives than one? Answer, no, not at the same time, but they believe that if their companion dies, they have the right to marry again. But we do disapprove of the custom which is gained in the world and has been practiced among us to our great mortification in marrying in 5 or 6 weeks, or even in 2 or 3 months after the death of their companion. We believe that with due respect ought to be had to the memory of the dead and the feelings of both friends and children, end quote. So polygamy was a constant accusation, and it was a common issue in Missouri during the 1838 war, but other issues were a little more pressing, and polygamy seemed to take a back burner as a criticism against Joseph Smith and the church in light of them, openly waging war against Missouri state militias. Nauvoo, however, provided opportunities for the fledgling kingdom to make its own rules and deal with polygamy the way that it saw most fitting. I should mention here that there are some folks who believe that Joseph Smith never practiced polygamy, that Joseph fought polygamy. The standard historical work which claims this is titled, indeed, Joseph Fought Polygamy, written by Richard and Pamela Price, 2 members of the RLDS Church who were integral in forming kind of their own faction of Orthodox RLDS Church as the RLDS religion was distancing itself from its unique and Orthodox roots in the 1970s and 80s. It's here that the school of people who believe that Joe never practiced polygamy assert that the Quorum of 12 actually introduced the practice after their mission to England, where polygamy was more prevalent. This is from chapter 5 of their book, Joseph Fought Polygamy. Quote, some of the apostles increased their interest in polygamy while in England. It was shown in the previous chapter that Brigham Young testified that he had polygamous manifestations while serving as a missionary apostle in England. Elder Edwin Stafford testified that he was satisfied that Brigham Young was in adultery while there. It should be remembered that the missionaries who went to the English mission were idolized by many of their converts, which had a tendency to increase polygamous desires. An example of their popularity is revealed in the following account. This is from the Ensign of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints of July 1987. Now, quoting that, quote, Elder Kimball, accompanied by Elder Feeling, walked to Chatburn and down Dunham for a last farewell. In Chatburn, the people left their work and flocked to the streets to greet them. Children followed them from place to place, singing. Some of them said that if they could but touch us, they seem better. They evidently believe there is virtue in Brother Kimball's cloak, Elder Fielding wrote. Now back to Joseph fought polygamy. In this setting, in a country where polygamy was a subject of discussion as it was in America, it was natural for the apostles and other missionaries to develop theories to justify their polygamous desires, kind of like Joseph Smith did. There is evidence that these brethren added to their desires for polygamy and belief in it as a result of their experiences in England. As mentioned previously, Brigham Young stated that, quote, while we were in England in 1839 and 40, I think the Lord manifested to me by vision and his spirit things concerning polygamy, that's editorialized by the Prices, that I did not then understand. There had never been a thought of it in the church that I ever knew anything about at that time. Lorenzo Snow, also a missionary to England and brother to Eliza Snow, who became a plural wife of Brigham, stated, and of Joseph Smith, I should add here, before finishing that, the editorializing in Joseph Fought Polygamy that they use in order to contextualize some of the quotes, I have to add some of my own editorializing to their quotes because they remove things or they add things that do not merit being included in these things. But they're obviously doing it with a slant, with a bias, with a justification that they are trying to arrive at the conclusion that Joseph Smith never practiced polygamy. So one more chunk out of that. There is no man that lives that had a more perfect knowledge of the principle of plural marriage, its holiness and divinity, than what I had. It was revealed to me before the prophet Joseph Smith explained it to me. I had been on a mission to England between 2 and 3 years, and before I left England, I was perfectly satisfied in regard to something connected with plural marriage. End quote. So this is, this book, we're going to be discussing it extensively today, that Joseph fought polygamy, apparently. Because later in the same chapter, the Prices continue to point the introduction of polygamy to the new converts from England and the apostles themselves, using as their data points the wives that were taken by church leaders in Utah. Continuing in chapter 5, quote, it is more than coincidence that many of the women who later became plural wives of the missionaries to England were women from the British Isles. This is another evidence that the English Avenue helped bring polygamy into the church. A list of the few of the missionaries sent to England and their first plural wives demonstrates this connection. Apostle Parley P. Pratt married a total of 12 wives. His first plural wife and 4 other plurals were taken from the British Isles. Apostle Heber C. Kimball married 43 wives, 8 of whom were from the British Isles. Apostle Orson Hyde married a total of 6 wives, and his first plural wife was of English birth. Apostle John Taylor married 15 wives. His first plural wife's birthplace was the Isle of Man, England. Thousands of devoted English saints joined the church, and it is tragic that the American missionaries, who should have been godly shepherds over the flock, ensnared some of them in the evil net of polygamy. End quote. So, I'll just say that I'm not sure how the ratio of English immigrant wives versus American citizen wives goes to bolster the argument that the Prices are making here, because it seems like the majority of the church leaders they listed here had the majority of their wives from American members, not converts from England. Their argument, however, is essentially that the accusations of polygamy that were aimed at the prophet were actually just an extension of the other leaders who were practicing polygamy while Joseph Smith actively fought it, knowing that such accusations would lead to ruin in the church. Now, the next chapter of their book illustrates multiple data points of public and private statements by the self-proclaimed prophet Joseph Smith when he openly denied polygamy, he denied accusations, and he also met with church leaders in order to apparently stamp out the practice. Before getting to those data points, though, It should be noted that none of these preclude Joe's participation in polygamy. They just illustrate that he repeatedly denied it publicly and privately. I personally am not inclined to believe anything that Joseph Smith ever said, but his public statements mean more to other people than they do to me. This is from chapter 6 of Joseph Fought Polygamy. Quote, "From the very beginning, the Lord gave warnings against the invasion of polygamy into the church. As early as 1831, he warned the saints," now quoting the Doctrine and Covenants, section 38, "And now I show unto you a mystery, a thing which has had in secret chambers to bring to pass even your destruction in process of time. And ye knew it not, but now I tell it unto you. And again I say unto you that the enemy in the secret chambers seeketh your lives, and that ye might escape the power of the enemy, and be gathered unto me a righteous people without spot and blameless. Wherefore, for this cause, I gave unto you the commandment that you should go to the Ohio, and there I will give unto you my law." End quote. Chapter 6 continues, quote, "Polygamy was the thing about which the Lord warned the saints. It was had in secret chambers among the Cochranites at the time of the church's beginnings. Also, it almost brought the church to destruction in process of time. No other factor nor problem has been so devastating to the Lord's work in these latter days. Some of the apostles and their friends began to practice it secretly in the early 1840s in secret chambers, and they knew it had to be denied and covered with falsehoods. Therefore, the polygamists banded together and conspired more and more to cover their secret acts." End quote. Now, I may be wrong, but I don't think we've ever actually discussed the Cochranites on this show before. So Cochranite was a term used to refer to the Society of Free Brethren and Sisters. That's what it was called, just like the way Mormon refers to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It was led by a guy named Jacob Cochran, who was born in 1782 in New Hampshire. And the parallels between Jacob Cochran and Joseph Smith are pretty remarkable. They claimed miracle working and exorcism. Check and check. They claimed raising the dead. Check on that parallel as well. Dancing in holy frenzies. Check when we talk about the Kirtland Church. Visions and personal revelation. Check again. They had special committees and books that only the trusted elites could see and use. That's another check. They talked about separating the wheat and the chaff and burning the chaff once sifted. Check on that similarity to Mormonism too. They tried forms of communalism like the Mormon United Order. There's another check. And they practiced polygamy. So there's that massive check. Notably, they practiced what they called, kind of free love within the community, and often leaders would basically assign people their partners using their ecclesiastical influence. So even more parallels. But they would also deny that they were practicing polygamy when they were asked by an outsider. This is from a contemporary named Ephraim Stinchfield, I guess, who spent a couple of days with the community, and he wrote an expose. Quote, "That each brother and sister in this fraternity has a spiritual husband, wife, mate, or yoke fellow, such as they choose, or their leaders choose for them. These spiritual mates dissolve or disannul all former marriage connections, just like Joseph Smith did, and many of them bed and board together, to the exclusion of all former vows. Such conduct as this had not become general, and many of them would deny that such things existed among them, though proved by the most solemn declarating of persons of undoubted veracity." End quote. Stinchfield goes on to make his own value judgment by decrying the immorality that he witnessed there, and he wished that he could basically shake all of the Cochranites by the shoulders to try and get this delusion out of their head and make it so they would stop following this holy leader and the theology that he had constructed for them. He goes on to say, quote, "I had, before I left this place, such a discovery of the mystery of iniquity, working to the subversion of all social ties between husband and wife, parents and children, rulers and ruled, ministers and people. The rising generation corrupted by the introduction of such vicious practices under a cloak of religion, that it seemed as if I should be constrained to run from house to house and cry day and night against the abomination that maketh desolate." End quote. The Cochranites were yet one more of the wacky religious cults in the burned over district. They just happened to, kind of openly practice free love instead of Mormonism that only approved of free love for the highest ranking initiates. There were Cochranites settlements located very close to early Mormon congregations. People like Warren Cowdery, William Marks, and the Wild Ram of the West, Lyman White, and a number of other early converts to the church all lived within a couple miles of these Cochranite settlements in New York and Maine before they converted to Mormonism. Those who claim that Joseph was never a polygamist point to the conversion of these folks as the people who actually introduced polygamy to justify adultery, and that the rumors of polygamy simply followed these people from their geographic proximity to the Cochranites to their following of Joseph Smith. The very first thing that a reader consumes from the Price's book, Joseph Fought Polygamy, is this from the first paragraph of chapter 1, quote, "For over a century and a half, the leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints with headquarters in Salt Lake City, Utah, have claimed that the prophet Joseph Smith Jr. received a revelation in July 1843, which commanded the saints to practice polygamy. The truth is, however, that polygamy in the church had its beginnings not with Joseph, but with a man named Jacob Cochran. About 1816, Cochran started a denomination in the area of Saco, Maine, in which he introduced polygamy. Some of his polygamous practices were later adopted by Apostles Brigham Young, John Taylor, Heber C. Kimball, Parley P. Pratt, Orson Hyde, and others. These church leaders secretly practiced polygamy in Nauvoo before Joseph's death without his approval." End quote. Now, what is really notable about Jacob Cochran is his death in 1836, which left the sect without a leader. Now, an historian named Ridlin published a history of the area in 1895, and he took some interviews of older folks living at the time who'd had personal experience with both Cochranism and Mormonism. The Price book quotes extensively from Ridlin to intertwine the early Mormon missionaries with the followers of Cochran, all of who were Utah practitioners of polygamy. Many of them were practitioners in Nauvoo, and of course, none of them were doing so with the approval of Joseph Smith, right? They continue, quote, "The Cochran craze paved the way for a Mormon invasion in the Saco Valley. A full-blooded Cochranite made a first-class Mormon saint." Now, this is their editorializing. It says, "This statement by Ridlin was printed in 1895 when the controversy over polygamy in Utah was receiving national attention and was at its zenith. It applies to the Mormon Church in Utah at the time and not the Latter-day Saints during the lifetime of Joseph Smith Jr." That's their editorializing, which I don't think is true, because the accusations of polygamy in Nauvoo, in Joseph Smith's Nauvoo Mormonism, were just as prevalent as they were during the Exodus, and as they were followed through many of the different factions of Mormonism that kind of split off from the Brighamites after Joseph Smith's death. Anyway, they continue from reporting what Ridlin's expose said. "Jake Cochran was a John the Baptist for the Mormon apostles who appeared on his old battleground and gathered up the spoils. The inhabitants of the river towns, as well as some in the interior, were afflicted with Cochranite grasshoppers, followed by Mormon locusts. Scions cut from the decaying trunk of the old Cochran tree were readily grafted into Mormon branches, but the fruit was not the same. When these had become firmly united, they were transplanted bodily to new soil, considered more congenial to their development in the state of New York. Some of the old people now living," and now this is what I'm saying, Ridlin actually interviewed some of these old people. This is in his history. "Some of the old people now living confound the two movements, and we have found insuperable difficulty in sifting the chaff of error from the wheat of truth. It seems to have been a most remarkable coincidence which has the appearance of concerted action between Cochran and his successors. Almost as soon as he vacated the field, the founders of the Mormon hierarchy invested in it. The history of the Mormon Church makes Brigham Young come to Maine in 1832 or 33. The doctrine preached by Smith, Pratt, and Young in York County was not of an offensive nature. It was, properly speaking, millenarianism." End quote. Now, when it says Smith in that line, the Price has editorialized it as Samuel Smith, because Samuel Smith was Joseph Smith's younger brother who did act as a missionary who went on a mission, converted Brigham Young, and he converted a number of other leading figures. But their editorializing of Smith there, adding in Samuel there, I don't necessarily agree with it. I would conclude that Ridlin, who actually wrote this history in 1895 and published it, was actually referring to Joseph Smith, because it was the church of Joseph Smith, Parley Pratt, and Brigham Young at the time. But the point overarching the conclusion of Ridlin here is that this Cochranite, it was an apocalyptic, millennialist, Christian, free love, anti-establishment cult with a supreme leader that instantly became leaderless. Those people who were following Jacob Cochran, who died in 1836, are going to be searching for a new apocalyptic, millennialist, Christian, free love, anti-establishment cult to join. So these missionaries were really smart to travel to the Cochranite settlements in search of converts, as Jacob Cochran was probably showing signs of old age and waning health. Now, the names of any Cochranites who converted to the church for any amount of time has proven elusive, at least to my search. What matters, though, is that the Cochranites held national notoriety. Here is a Nashville Gazette article out of Tennessee in July of 1819, and please just listen to how the papers talk about Cochran and think of how similar these things sound to dozens of articles that we've read on the show before written about Mormonism. Quote, from the Boston Centennial of June 5th, impostor punished, Saco, May 25th, 1819. The county of York, particularly this town, Kennebunk, Buxton, etc., has long been infested by a religious impostor named Jacob Cochran, who pretended to have a mission to spread a new religion. His process was to gull a few men, then to seduce the women, married and single, to attend his ministrations, swear them to secrecy, then induce them to commit the most lascivious and criminal acts. This conduct had become notorious, and the grand jury of the county at the late term of the Supreme Court found no less than 5 bills of indictment against him. On one of these, for lascivious behavior, he was cleared, the jury, after being up all night, not agreeing one of their number, a disciple, refusing his assent. He was then tried on an indictment for adultery and convicted. But having been admitted to bail and not having been surrendered into court, he hopped the twig and has not been since heard of, leaving his sureties to pay $1,800. He has thus probably escaped a 3-year visit to the state prison. Jacob Cochran is about 35 years old, common size, well-built, light-complexioned, rather sandy hair, dresses well, and has the manners of a half-gentleman. We have seen, says the Newburyport Herald, a pamphlet published by a Baptist minister of regular standing in New Gloucester, giving an account of Cochran and his deluded followers. It appears that under the guise of religion they have committed the most indecent and abominable acts of adultery in every possible shape human depravity could devise. One of their leading tenets was to dissolve the ties of matrimony, like Joseph Smith did, as suited their convenience, and a promiscuous sexual intercourse was tolerated, by each male being allowed to take 7 wives. It seems Cochran, the high priest of iniquity, had nearly half his female followers for wives in the course of his ministration, which has been 2 years standing. Where has been the vigilance of the civil authority all this time? End quote. You see, Jacob Cochran made national headlines repeatedly, but this one sticks out as quite remarkable. This was printed all over the nation. The Kentucky Gazette, Pittsfield Sun out of Massachusetts, the Vermont Journal, the Evening Post in New York, the Susquehanna Democrat from the county that Emma Hale lived in at the time when she was only 15 years old when this was published. This story went all over the place. But the facts of the case are certainly interesting. Jacob Cochran was indicted on multiple charges, including lascivious activity with women, adultery, and I would assume probably counterfeiting and disturbing the peace, and a few other similar accusations. The jury wouldn't decide because one of his followers was on the jury, but then he was tried for adultery alone. He got convicted to a 3-year sentence and then got out on bail of $1,800 and skipped town. All of those same facts hit Joseph Smith at some point in his life as well, and were largely the reason that he had to flee Kirtland, Ohio for Missouri in the first place in 1838. The parallels between Jacob Cochran and Joseph Smith are simply remarkable, and they were even recognized by contemporary newspapers. This is out of the Unitarian. This is published out of Boston. They wrote an article about the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith in February of 1834. This was 2 years before Jacob Cochran died, only 4 years into Joseph Smith's ministry. This is what it says. Here's just a short excerpt. Quote, "It is well known to most of our readers, we presume, that some years since the Cochran delusion, as it is called, prevailed in and around Saco, a village in the state of Maine. What gave that delusion success? Why, Cochran spoke with great fluency, warned sinners with great earnestness, and poured forth his prayers with great fervor. The people were so much affected. Many were in tears. Many were sobbing aloud. Many cried out for mercy, and some were even prostrated upon the floor. Surely then, those under the influence of the delusion we speak of would say, the Spirit of God was powerfully and visibly present. Surely, they would say, the doctrines advanced by Cochran must be true. The measures adopted by him are owned of God. So with the Mormon delusion. The preachers are fluent. They warn sinners with earnestness. They pray with fervor. The people are affected. The Spirit of God is especially powerful and visibly present. And consequently, the opinions advanced must be correct. The measures adopted are owned of God. In this way, men of sound judgment in other respects are carried away through the influence of their erroneous views on the operations of the Spirit and become the dupes of the delusion." End quote. It should be noted that when this was published, Jacob Cochran would be dead only 2 years later, and his movement would quickly lose steam and die out soon after. Mormonism in 1834 was gaining steam. When Cochran died, he apparently had, quote-unquote, thousands of followers, which has a lot of variability, obviously, but in 1834, Mormonism also had, quote-unquote, thousands of followers. The sects were very similar in many ways, and those parallels obviously didn't escape contemporary commentators. So the entire reason for discussing the Cochranites here is to exhibit the movement as a contemporary religion with incredible numbers of similarities to Mormonism. The Book of Mormon illustrates that Joseph Smith was a synthesizer of thoughts and philosophies. His ministry and doctrines similarly show his ability to snatch up ideas and practices that were floating through the air and make them his own. The consequences Jacob Cochran faced for running basically a free love polygamy ring were very similar to the consequences Joe had to deal with throughout the majority of his ministry. The people who believe Joe never practiced polygamy are quick to call on the Cochranites as the corrupting influence on various church leaders that practiced a system of quote-unquote spiritual wifery, as the term, was a Cochranite specific term. And many of the accusations against Mormonism used that same term of spiritual wifery. In the Price's book, Joseph Fought Polygamy, they point not only to the Cochranites repeatedly, but to John C. Reckitt Bennett as the transmitter of that knowledge to the Nauvoo Empire. Chapter 7 lays out their argument. Permit a brief reading. Quote, "Though the church was exposed to polygamy by the Cochranites, the practice of that evil doctrine at Nauvoo had its beginnings through the instrumentality of a young medical doctor named John Cook Bennett. Dr. Bennett taught that Joseph had received revelations from God on the subject of polygamy, and that, quote, it was one of the mysteries of God, which was to be revealed when the people was strong enough in the faith to bear such mysteries, end quote. This is the same doctrine that the Mormon Church uses as its basis for the practice of polygamy. It is also the doctrine which Jacob Cochran used 25 years earlier when he founded the Cochranite sect at Saco, Maine, which is proof that Utah Mormon polygamy originated with Jacob Cochran and not with Joseph Smith. Jacob Cochran provided material for Bennett to use in laying his polygamous foundation, and Brigham Young built upon it." They continue later in Chapter 7. "The young doctor came to Nauvoo posing as a single man and was soon engaged in secret illicit sexual activity. Quickly, he gathered a group around him. The majority were young men and women, and secretly taught them that, quote, promiscuous intercourse between the sexes was a doctrine believed in by the Latter-day Saints, end quote. When they asked how such could be possible when they had heard Joseph preach much against polygamy, Bennett had a ready answer. He claimed that he was in a position to know exactly what was going on because he was boarding at Joseph's home and was acting as a temporary member of the First Presidency in place of Sidney Rigdon, who was ill. He explained to them that Joseph was preaching so much against polygamy because of the prejudice of the public and Emma's strong opposition to that doctrine. Emma's opposition to polygamy was well known by the saints. Bennett's assurances were so convincing that his secret circle of friends accepted his lies as truth, and they began practicing spiritual wifery. Among those ensnared in his web were Sarah Pratt, wife of Apostle Orson Pratt, Nancy Rigdon, daughter of Sidney, Chauncey and Francis Higbee, sons of church historian Elias Higbee, and others." End quote. Now, these are all true statements, but all of them are contextualized such to remove any of Joe's involvement in any of these matters, which is troubling because all of the women looped into the scandal pointed at Joseph Smith as the instigator and Bennett as the beneficiary and propagator, instead of Bennett himself being the instigator and beneficiary. Now, as Reckitt Bennett began to go, super critical and the Bennett meltdown happened, that's episodes 119 through 134, if you want to go back into the backlog and listen, allegations flew all around Nauvoo that tie Joe into the sex ring in ways that simply cannot be interpreted to show that he was actually fighting the practice. So much as he was, trying to fight the media storm resulting from Bennett. Now, one of these events that exhibited the major issues with Mormon polygamy was Martha Brotherton. We've talked about what happened with her on this podcast as well as on My Book of Mormon, but suffice it to say, Bloody Brigham Young really liked 17-year-old Martha Brotherton, a British convert who had recently migrated to Nauvoo. Brigham wanted her as a wife, so Heber Kimball brought her into the red brick store where Bloody Brigham confronted her with his proposal. He couldn't seal the deal because Brotherton just wouldn't accept it. Brigham brought in Joseph Smith to push her. Joe came in and locked the door behind him and continued to push this 17-year-old Martha to accept Brigham's proposal. She continued to resist and eventually agreed to never tell anybody about this interaction. She was only released after she agreed to give Bloody Brigham a kiss and swore to secrecy. She went home and immediately told her friend of the interaction. She wrote it down and then she gave the information to Reckitt Bennett, who was collecting information for his forthcoming expose on Joseph Smith that was titled History of the Saints. Of course, patrons of the show, they got that entire audio book with my commentary along with it. So if you want to listen to The History of the Saints by John C. Bennett, circa 1842, toss us $1 a show at patreon.com/nakedmormonism, and you get a whole bunch of extra content along with that audiobook. Suffice it to say, when the Martha Brotherton story got out, people were astonished that Bloody Brigham and Joe would lock a teenager in a room and basically force her to either agree to becoming a spiritual wife or swear to never tell anybody about the proposal. The entire interaction was incredibly disturbing, and the pattern it reveals is even more disturbing. Joseph Smith published carefully worded denials that anything of the sort happened. Quote, he, meaning Hiram Smith, then spoke in contradiction of a report in circulation about Elder Kimball, Brigham Young himself, and others of the 12, alleging that a sister had been shut in a room for several days, and that they had endeavored to induce her to believe in having 2 wives. President Joseph Smith spoke upon the subject of the stories respecting Elder Kimball and others, showing the folly and inconsistency of spending any time in conversing about such stories or hearkening to them. For there is no person which is acquainted with our principles who would believe such lies except Sharp, the editor of the Warsaw Signal. End quote. Now that's notable, to call out Thomas Sharp from the Warsaw Signal. And an August 1842 Warsaw Signal article by Tom Ash Sharp really points out the issue here. Quote, a man who, under the garb of religion, can commit the most villainous, swindling operations, not only upon the poor dupes whom he has induced to follow his standard, but also upon the whole community, who can commit murder and rapine under the pretended sanctions of heaven, and sacrifice hundreds of his devoted band for the accomplishment of his unholy purposes, is capable of any act of enormity to which human nature is equal. The testimony of General Bennett, then, although of no weight if it stood alone, has force and effect when taken in connection with that of Dr. Avard, William Hines Phelps, and others as given before the Court of Inquiry in Missouri, and the direct corroborations of Colonel Higbee and Miss Martha H. Brotherton. All go to show the point arrived at, viz., that Joe Smith is a most consummate villain and knave, end quote. Now that's a really important point that Tom Ash Sharp makes in the Warsaw Signal. Reckitt Bennett wasn't really known to be a trustworthy guy, but when his expose is taken in the context of all of the corroborating statements from other people in and out of the church, it simply cannot be claimed that Joe fought polygamy. He was an instigator, accessory to, and beneficiary of the practice from its start to his death. The Bennett meltdown instigated numerous articles, sermons, and public statements with hundreds or thousands of signatories denying that anything of the sort was happening. August, September, and October articles in the Times and Seasons in 1842 all denied polygamy or any practice of quote-unquote plurality of wives. During all of these statements, Joe was taking more and more wives. Now, an important detail throughout all of this was the perceived difference of celestial marriage and sealings compared with plurality of wives and spiritual wifery. The latter terms were used in derision. The former terms were divine commandments of Joe's personal God. In function, the labels didn't matter much because they looked the same, but the difference was Joseph Smith. If a certain plural marriage received his personal approval, that was celestial marriage, and the participants were sealed together. As 1842 progressed into 1843 and Joe took another dozen women into his harem, crackdowns were continually more and more necessary. In October of 1843, Joe had his eyes on the presidency, and he needed to rein in some of the rumors as he expected that his persona would be more scrutinized than ever before as he entered the national public presidential campaign sphere. So he met with William Clayton, or Quilliam Claypen as we call him, to discuss what to do and how to approach the issue of polygamy. Claypen recorded in Joe's journal for that day, quote, "Evening at home and walked up and down the street with my scribe, gave instruction to try those who were preaching, teaching, or practicing the doctrine of plurality of wives on this law. Joseph forbids it, and the practice thereof, no man shall have but one wife." End quote. These directions that Joe gave to Quilliam Claypen, they were followed with only the anointed quorum and Joseph Smith himself accepted, because soon after this, a man named Orsimus F. Bostwick accused Hiram's sidekick Abiff Smith of teaching polygamy, and Hiram sued the man for slander. The case was thrown out of the Nauvoo Municipal Court with Joe as chairman because of course it was, and Joe threatened Bostwick's attorney, Francis Higbee, telling him that if he takes the case to the district court in Carthage, that it'll bring the whole state down on Nauvoo. This was purely out of fear, because Joe knew that the case wasn't fair and that Hiram had actually been preaching polygamy, and he had 3 or 4 wives of his own at the time. If the case with Orsimus F. Bostwick and Hiram Smith was heard outside of the confines of Nauvoo, if it were appealed to the district circuit in Carthage, then Hiram may be forced to testify on the stand, which would reveal a lot of troubling facts about what was really going on inside Nauvoo. We discussed the details of this on episode 173, Emma's My Hero, along with a poem that was published in the Warsaw Signal titled Buckeye's Lamentation for Want of More Wives. What this case revealed, though, to the leadership and to Joseph specifically was that they needed to tighten the requirements for who was taught about celestial marriage, or else the word might leak out to an extent that wasn't actually controllable, like this case with Bostwick and Hiram Smith had been. So Joe's meeting with Quilliam Claypen was for this purpose, to spread the word among the general leadership that no man shall have but one wife. But then, of course, there were always the closed-door meetings with the most trusted elites where they could take more wives at the approval of Joseph Smith, thereby granting them the label of a celestial marriage, a sealing, instead of just being called spiritual wifery. Now, this represents a dividing point in the church. While having over 30 wives of his own in early 1844, Joe went on a crusade to show that the church publicly had a strict no-tolerance policy on anything like spiritual wifery. A man named Hiram Brown in late January of 1844 was one of these trusted elites who had been taught about plural marriage, celestial marriage, about the new and everlasting covenant, right? But apparently he had leaked it to the wrong person, or he wasn't delicate enough in his proposal, because Hiram Brown was publicly excommunicated on February 1st, 1844, because he, quote, has been preaching polygamy. He has been cut off from the church for his iniquity, end quote. This public face Joe put on the church didn't scrub the previous accusations from the record. It was all too little too late. What is extremely notable at this time is that historians can't demonstrate that Joe took any wives in 1844. Any women we have evidence for a relationship with Joe with in 1844 is very scant, and it's hard to verify. Now I'm going to quote briefly from Todd Compton's In Sacred Loneliness for this timeline. Quote, "As we trace the trajectory of Smith's marriages, we see that he apparently experimented with plural marriage in the 1830s in Ohio and Missouri. Detailed records are not extant, but the evidence, when weighed carefully, suggests that these were probably authentic plural marriages." Which, when we say authentic plural marriages, obviously that's a term that historians are using to describe what we perceive as plural marriages that are sanctioned by the prophet himself versus ones that are just termed spiritual wifery, right? Compton continues. In 1841, Smith cautiously added 3 wives, but in 1842, he married 11 wives in the first 8 months of the year. New marriages then stopped for 5 months, a significant gap, perhaps caused by the John Bennett expose in which Smith's former right-hand man published a series of lurid articles chronicling Joseph's alleged misdeeds, including polygamy. However, during the first half of 1843, Joseph married 14 more wives, including 5 in May. After July, his marriages stopped abruptly, with only 2 exceptions in September and November. He took no wives during the last 8 months of his life, a striking fact, especially when contrasted with the number of women he married during the previous 2 years." End quote. This seems to illustrate, to me at least, that Joe was smart enough to bring things to a close. In fact, the Price book claiming that Joe never practiced polygamy and he even fought it, uses a meeting that Joe held with stake president of Nauvoo, William Marks, about the topic as evidence that he fought it until his death. Quote, "I met with Brother Joseph. He said that he wanted to converse with me on the affairs of the church, and we retired by ourselves. I will give his words verbatim, for they are indelibly stamped upon my mind. He said that he had desired for a long time to have a talk with me on the subject of polygamy. He said it eventually would prove the overthrow of the church, and we should soon be obliged to leave the United States unless it could be speedily put down. He was satisfied that it was a cursed doctrine, and that there must be every exertion made to put it down. He said that he would go before the congregation and proclaim against it, and I must go into the high council, and he would prefer charges against those in transgression, and I must sever them from the church unless they made ample satisfaction. There was much more said, but this was the substance. The mob commenced to gather at Carthage in a few days after. Therefore, there was nothing done concerning it. After the prophet's death, I made mention of this conversation to several, hoping and believing that it would have a good effect. But to my great disappointment, it was soon rumored about that Brother Marks was about to apostatize, and that all that he said about the conversation with the prophet was a tissue of lies." End quote. Marks was always opposed to polygamy. Right, especially during the Schism crisis, because his vote during the Schism crisis after Joe and Hiram's deaths proved to be one of the sharpest dividing lines throughout the membership. We're going to discuss Marks a bit more as we near August of 1844, but suffice it to say, Marks was a guy with his head on straight and later became a primary leader in the RLDS Church once Joseph III was old enough to take the mantle. The Prices used this meeting and Joe's statement during it as evidence that he was struggling with all of the polygamy accusations and was beginning an actual crusade to bring the practice to an end once and for all. That, of course, is predicated on the assertion that Joe himself never practiced it, which I find to be a flawed predication, right? Especially in light of other statements by many other church leaders, including Marks himself, like this one, which I'm reading from Compton's In Sacred Loneliness. Quote, "When the doctrine of polygamy was introduced into the church as a principle of exaltation, I took a decided stand against it, which stand rendered me quite unpopular with many of the leading ones of the church. Joseph, however, became convinced before his death that he had done wrong. For about 3 weeks before his death, I met him one morning on the street, and he said to me, 'Brother Marks, we are a ruined people.' I asked, 'How so?' He said, 'This doctrine of polygamy or spiritual wife system that has been taught and practiced among us will prove our destruction and overthrow. I have been deceived,' said he, in reference to its practice. 'It is wrong. It is a curse to mankind, and we shall have to leave the United States soon unless we can put it down and its practice stopped in the church.'" End quote. Joe wasn't wrong. Plural marriage was a scourge on the church, and Joe had only been able to barely keep it from going public multiple times by this point. With his name in national headlines in light of his presidential campaign, the nation collectively turned their skeptical eye to his past and ministry as Mormon prophet, and they didn't like what they saw. Our discussion last week reveals that Joe was actively shopping around for the next Mormon settlement because all of this was coming to a head sooner or later. He could feel it. It was in the air. By May of 1844, Joe could see the only possible answer was fleeing beyond the boundaries of national politics and policing. Congress wouldn't recognize Nauvoo as a sovereign territory, so Texas or Oregon Territory or California or Mexico or Canada, Anywhere that laws could be flaunted or simply didn't exist was the only place that Joe could comfortably run his own church with impunity. The fact that he didn't take any new wives throughout 1844 is evidence enough that Joe knew his current system. It may be fun, it may be rewarding, it was probably full of instant gratification, but it wasn't sustainable. His private statements alone reveal that the lines historians use today to distinguish between celestial marriage and spiritual wifery are presentist. They are lines used to determine the difference between God-sanctioned marriage and just rampant free love. Both those lines are people today imposing value judgments on the people of the past based on how we are able to interpret the evidence today through our own lenses. Just like with people leveraging the Cochranite movement to somehow prove a transmittal of ideas to Joseph Smith, it's completely unnecessary. Joe didn't learn that he could have multiple women as partners from another religious leaders. It was something he and many other people want in their relationship, and he found a religious justification for his conduct, or he constructed that religious justification, just like every immoral religious leader has for all of human history. Claiming that Joe got polygamy from somewhere else or that he fought it places causality in the wrong direction, and it ignores evidence. These intellectual exercises in futility are done to scrub Joe's name of anything that we may construe as immoral through our lens today, and I would argue it's all for nothing. Place the judgment of his morality where it belongs by evaluating his conduct to acquire multiple partners, not on the fact that he had multiple partners. Instead of thinking of, Joseph Smith and other early church leaders may have been immoral because they had sex outside of marriage, consider how they acquired those relationships. Religious coercion, grooming, lying and deception, and calculated schemes of integrating certain women into certain classes of ranking by their attractiveness and willingness to engage into the system. It's an immoral construct. Joseph Smith isn't immoral because he had multiple partners. He's immoral because he used his contrived position to coerce his subordinates to give him their teenage daughters so he could rape them. That's what this issue really boils down to. Anybody defending Joseph Smith, his legacy, or his carefully devised doctrine about celestial marriage instead of spiritual wifery, they bear the weight of his evil on their own shoulders. Those claiming he never practiced polygamy, they're few and far between, but they do so only by ignoring the voices of his victims, which is reprehensible in and of itself. No matter which way you slice it, no matter what angle you look at it from, no matter how much you cherry pick evidence from it, Joseph Smith's legacy isn't something to revere, but abhor. He was dishonest, vile, and completely depraved. And every single person alive who suffers as a result of his life's creation are victims of a completely corrupt and exploitative system with absolutely no moral code. Mormonism isn't just wrong, it's just wrong. That is going to do it for our episode today. We do have a new couple of patrons to thank over at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. We have a new pledge from Easton as well as from Craig. So thank you to our newest patrons who get a whole bunch of extra content over on the patron exclusive feed that you can get for as little as $1 an episode. We also had a couple of pledge deletions and a relatively consequential pledge edit. So that leaves us at negative $19 from last week. So if you want to get on the actual NAMO family of the patron exclusive feed and help mitigate those fluctuations, you can do so at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. And once again, you get access to a whole bunch of extra content, including the patron only episodes of the show, which have the variety show at the end. With all that, we are done for the episode today. Of course, huge thanks to all of the listeners who stuck around for the episode, who stuck around for all of 2019. I hope you're having a fantastic 2020 so far. Here's to looking up to the new year and this historic 2020, as the prophets have led us to believe. Thanks so much for listening, everybody. I hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager, Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer, and Andrew Torres of the Opening Arguments podcast and the law offices of P. Andrew Torres as legal counsel. Music is written and produced by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.com and used with permission. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2020, all rights reserved.